I stood motionless as flames danced in the air, devouring everything in their path. The proud stone wall, built over a century ago and once a symbol of strength and heritage, collapsed into ash before my eyes. The roar of the fire was overwhelming, but it was the laughter that truly shattered me. Karen, the tyrant at the helm of our HOA, stood just a few yards away. Arms crossed, a cruel smirk etched on her face. She watched the destruction with a satisfaction that made my blood boil. For years, that wall had been the heart of my property, a barrier that not only marked the boundary of my land, but also represented the legacy of my family, passed down through generations. It had withstood storms, wars, and the march of time. And now, under Karen's cold, bureaucratic decree, it was reduced to nothing more than a pile of charred rubble. She had ordered its demolition, citing aesthetic nonconformity and community standards, without ever bothering to consult me, the owner. In that searing moment, as the last embers faded into the night, I knew that Karen's petty obsession with uniformity had crossed a line. Little did she understand that behind the ashes of that wall lay more than just memories. There was power that I had long held in secret. I owned not only the land where that wall once stood, but, as many would soon learn, half of the entire neighborhood. My property stretched farther than anyone had ever dared to imagine, and its true boundaries were hidden beneath legal documents and ancient deeds. The flames that consumed my family's legacy ignited a fire in me as well, a burning resolve to reclaim what was rightfully mine and to expose Karen for the petty despot she truly was. Tonight, as the embers of the demolished wall smoldered on the ground, I vowed that I would turn her punishment into my victory. I would remind everyone that creativity, heritage, and property rights are not to be trifled with. And by the time the dawn broke, Karen would understand that her reign of bureaucratic terror was about to face a reckoning unlike any she had ever seen. Cedar Hollow Estates was the picture of suburban perfection, a meticulously planned gated community where every lawn was trimmed to precision, every house painted in uniform tones, and every resident expected to toe the line of strict regulations enforced by the local homeowners association. The HOA prided itself on maintaining a pristine image. Its rules were detailed to the last nuance, dictating everything from the type of shrub allowed in front yards to the acceptable style of architectural embellishments. In such a community, deviation was a sin, and the enforcer of these rules was none other than Karen Miller. Karen, in her early 50s and always impeccably dressed in tailored business attire, was a walking emblem of authority. With a clipboard clutched tightly in one hand and a smartphone in the other, she patrolled Cedar Hollow with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. Every stray detail, every quirk of individuality in the neighborhood was ruthlessly documented and promptly punished. To Karen, order was paramount, and nothing, not even the cherished traditions of longtime residents, could disrupt the vision of perfect uniformity she was determined to uphold. I, on the other hand, was a second-generation landowner whose family had built a legacy on this land. My property, spanning over 150 acres, was more than just a plot on a map. It was a living museum of history and passion. At the heart of my estate stood the venerable stone wall, built 100 years ago by my great-grandfather. That wall had marked the boundary of our homestead for generations, sheltering orchards, a small farm stand, and a myriad of family memories. It was a testament to hard work, resilience, and a love for the land that modern regulations could never quantify. While most residents of Cedar Hollow Estates followed the HOA's strict dictates without question, I cherished the freedom to honor my family's legacy. I had always believed that tradition and creativity were not mutually exclusive, that the beauty of history lay in its imperfections and individuality. My farm stand, a modest yet vibrant hub where I sold organic produce and homemade preserves, was an embodiment of that belief. It was a celebration of local heritage, a stark contrast to the sterile uniformity enforced by Karen and her minions. Over the years, I had endured countless fines for minor infractions, Complaints about the incongruity of my decorative elements, the clashing colors of my signage, and even the unorthodox design of my farm stand. Each penalty felt like an assault on my identity, a small but significant reminder that in Cedar Hollow, creativity was secondary to conformity. Then, without warning, Karen ordered the demolition of my 100-year-old stone wall under the guise of updating community standards. The decision was swift and unilateral. No consultation, no empathy, just cold, bureaucratic arrogance. Little did she know, that wall was not only the pride of my family, but also a symbol of a power that I had long concealed. Hidden in old deeds and legal documents was the fact that I owned nearly half of Cedar Hollow estates. My family's holdings were vast, and the land's true boundaries extended far beyond what the HOA claimed. Karen's ignorance of this truth would soon be her undoing. In that moment, as I surveyed the smoldering remains of my ancestral wall, I realized that Karen's tyranny had gone too far. It was time to fight back, not just for my own sake, but for every resident who believed in the right to live freely and honor their heritage. And I knew that the battle for property rights, creative expression, and community justice was about to reach a fever pitch. The demolition of the wall sent shockwaves through Cedar Hollow estates. I received a flurry of calls and messages from neighbors, some sympathetic and others incredulous at the HOA's audacity. The wall had stood for 100 years, a physical embodiment of the history and character of our community. Its sudden, unceremonious destruction was not only a personal loss, but a violation of the collective heritage of our neighborhood. I quickly gathered every piece of evidence I could find. Photographs of the wall before its fall, time-stamped video clips from my security cameras capturing the demolition crew at work, and copies of the HOA notice that cited vague aesthetic violations as justification for the act. I was determined to hold those responsible accountable. I submitted my evidence to the HOA board and demanded an explanation for the demolition. But I knew Karen Miller, ever the unyielding enforcer, would simply claim that the wall no longer met the modern standards of Cedar Hollow. The board, mired in bureaucratic red tape and long accustomed to Karen's overreach, dismissed my concerns as trivial and urged me to accept the changes as part of community progress. The injustice stung deeply. Not only had they destroyed a piece of my family's legacy, but they had also trampled on the rights of every resident who valued history and individuality. It wasn't long before whispers of dissent began to spread. I started a blog post detailing the history of the wall, its significance to my family, and how its demolition was a symbol of the HOA's oppressive policies. The post quickly went viral within our community, sparking heated debates on forums and social media groups. Hashtags like #WallOfHistory and #PropertyRights rising trended locally, and I received an outpouring of support from residents who felt similarly oppressed by the HOA's rigid rules. Fueled by this momentum, I began to plan my counterstrike. I had long known that the legal documents in my possession proved that I owned nearly half of Cedar Hollow estates, a fact that the HOA had conveniently ignored. With this leverage, I decided to take a stand that would not only reclaim my rightful property, but also expose the hypocrisy of the HOA's actions. I began reviewing the old deeds and property maps, consulting with legal experts to ensure that every step I took would be airtight. I knew that Karen's arrogance and ignorance of the true land boundaries were her greatest weaknesses. I decided that it was time to use that to my advantage. My plan was simple yet audacious. I would publicly announce that I owned half of the neighborhood, and that any further attempts to alter the community's character without proper consultation would come at a steep price. I drafted an open letter to the HOA board and to every resident in Cedar Hollow, detailing the legal facts, the historical significance of the demolished wall, and my intention to take decisive action if the board failed to reverse the demolition and reform its policies. As I prepare my digital dossier, I also reached out to influential community members, local business owners, longtime residents, and even a few sympathetic board members who shared their own grievances about the arbitrary enforcement of rules. Their testimonials, combined with my evidence, formed a powerful coalition that demanded accountability and change. Late one evening, As the temperature dropped and the stars began to twinkle above the now empty space where the wall once stood, I uploaded my open letter online. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors flooded the comments with support, and the hashtag own half the neighborhood began to circulate. It was clear that the community was ready for a reckoning, a turning point where the oppressive policies of the HOA would be challenged head-on. Karen Miller, meanwhile, remained defiant. In a hastily recorded video posted on the HOA's official social media page, she insisted that the demolition was for the greater good and that any dissent was simply a rejection of progress. But her words rang hollow in the face of the undeniable evidence and the swelling public outcry. My next step was to call a meeting with the board. I knew that if I could force them to confront the facts, that I owned half of Cedar Hollow and that my family's legacy was being trampled upon, the tide would finally turn. I meticulously prepared my case, organizing every piece of evidence into a comprehensive presentation that would leave no doubt about the injustice that had been done. The conflict was no longer just about a demolished wall. It had grown into a battle for the soul of Cedar Hollow Estates, a fight between the oppressive, outdated regime of the HOA and the vibrant, independent spirit of its residents. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation that would force everyone to reevaluate what it truly meant to belong to a community. In the days that followed the public outcry, Cedar Hollow Estates became a cauldron of tension and debate. Social media exploded with posts, videos, and heated discussions about the demolished wall and the HOA's overreach. Residents who had long kept their frustrations bottled up now found their voices, and digital petitions demanding reform of the HOA's policies quickly amassed thousands of signatures. Hashtags like hashtag property rights rising and hashtag Cedar Hollow Revolt trended across the community, signaling that the residents were no longer willing to stand idly by while their heritage was dismantled. Local news stations were soon on the scene. Reporters captured the raw emotion of neighbors gathered outside the ruins of the wall, interviewing residents who recounted family stories tied to the historic structure. That wall was our connection to the past, one elderly neighbor tearfully explained on live television. It stood for everything our community is about: heritage, strength, and unity. To see it reduced to ashes by bureaucrats is a tragedy beyond words. The emotional testimonies resonated deeply with viewers, and the story quickly became a symbol of resistance against arbitrary rule enforcement. Inside the HOA board, tensions began to boil over. Emergency meetings were convened in closed rooms, and leaked minutes revealed a deep rift among board members. Some long-standing members defended Karen Miller's strict policies, arguing that uniformity was essential for maintaining property values. Others, swayed by the overwhelming digital evidence and the impassioned voices of the residents, questioned whether the board had lost touch with the community's true needs. We are here to serve our residents, not to impose a sterile vision of perfection, one board member was quoted as saying in a leaked memo. The internal discord only fueled the public's growing demand for change. I continued to update my online community with every new development. I posted video logs of my meeting with the board, screenshots of the legal documents proving my ownership of half of Cedar Hollow Estates, and detailed breakdowns of the costs, both emotional and financial, that the demolition had inflicted on our community. My updates were met with a tidal wave of support, and soon influential bloggers and local activists joined the cause, amplifying our message and urging the board to take decisive action. Karen Miller, for her part, tried to spin the narrative. In a series of social media posts, she insisted that the demolition was necessary to modernize the neighborhood and that any criticism was a rejection of progress. But every attempt to justify her actions was met with mounting digital evidence that told a different story. A story of a historic wall, a family legacy, and a community's unyielding determination to protect its heritage. As the pressure mounted, the HOA board finally announced that a final public hearing would be held to address the controversy and to decide the future of their enforcement policies. The announcement sent shockwaves through Cedar Hollow Estates. Neighbors organized rallies, distributed flyers, and held impromptu meetings at local cafes, all while rallying behind the hashtag own half the neighborhood. The collective energy was palpable, a clear sign that the community was ready to reclaim its identity and put an end to arbitrary rule enforcement. In the days leading up to the hearing, I spent every spare moment refining my presentation. I reached out to legal experts who confirmed that the HOA had no right to demolish a structure that was a designated historical asset without proper consultation. I gathered testimonials from neighbors, each recounting how the wall had once been a proud symbol of our shared heritage. I even secured a letter for a local historical society, praising the wall as an irreplaceable piece of Cedar Hollow's history. Every piece of evidence, every personal story added weight to my case. The tension in the community reached a fever pitch. Every shared post, every hashtag, every comment on community forums echoed the same message. Our history matters, our rights matter, and we will no longer be bullied by a system that values conformity over creativity. The stage was set for a final showdown, a public hearing that would determine not just the fate of a demolished wall, but the future of Cedar Hollow Estates itself. The decisive moment arrived on a crisp morning as I walked into the packed boardroom at Cedar Hollow Community Center. The room was filled with HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and hundreds of determined residents, each one there to witness the final public vote that would decide the future of our neighborhood's enforcement policies. With a calm yet unyielding resolve, Councilwoman Angela Reed stepped up to the podium, her eyes reflecting the collective hope of a community that had grown tired of arbitrary power. After a thorough review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, legal documents proving property rights, and the heartfelt testimonies of our residents, we have reached an inescapable conclusion. Councilwoman Reed began, her voice steady and authoritative. It is abundantly clear that the demolition of the 100-year-old wall was not only a grievous violation of our community's heritage, but also a blatant abuse of power by those who believe they could impose their will without consequence. Our historical assets and our property rights must be protected, and no resident should have to endure such unchecked authority. A heavy silence fell over the room as Reed continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all fines and sanctions related to this incident, and we will initiate a comprehensive disciplinary review of the policies and practices that allowed this overreach. Furthermore, new guidelines will be implemented to safeguard our community's historical landmarks and ensure that every homeowner's rights are respected. Today's vote is not merely about a demolished wall. It is a resounding declaration that Cedar Hollow Estates values truth, heritage, and individual freedom over blind conformity. Her words struck a chord, and murmurs of agreement spread throughout the assembly. At that moment, a well-respected community advocate, a man who had spent decades fighting for local rights, rose to speak. "Today, we stand united," he declared, his voice ringing with passion. "No one in our community should be forced to watch their heritage be erased by bureaucratic tyranny. Let this vote be the turning point, a clear signal that our community will defend its history and our rights with every resource at our disposal. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every violation of our collective heritage is righted." His declaration was met with thunderous applause, uniting the room in a collective call for justice. Following his address, a senior officer from the local historical commission presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of digital evidence, expert testimonies, and official historical records that confirmed the wall's significance and the illegality of its demolition without proper consent. The evidence was irrefutable. The wall was a designated historical asset, and its destruction was a flagrant abuse of power. The Internal Affairs Panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures against those responsible, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release. Councilwoman Reed concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Cedar Hollow Estates, a community where our history is cherished and where every resident's rights are upheld with honor." Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will not allow personal vendettas to erase the legacy of our past. Together, we stand for justice, transparency, and the inalienable right to preserve our heritage. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our battle for historical and property rights. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Cedar Hollow Estates. The days of arbitrary demolitions and unchecked power were over, and a future built on respect for history and individual rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the final vote, Cedar Hollow Estates underwent a profound transformation. News of the rescinded fines, the comprehensive disciplinary review, and the sweeping new reforms enacted by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and online forums. Editorials bearing headlines such as "A New Dawn for Cedar Hollow" and "Community United for Heritage and Freedom" celebrated the decisive actions taken to protect our historical assets and property rights. Hashtags like #HeritageMatters, #NoMoreChibullying, and #PropertyRightsForever trended widely, reinforcing our collective commitment to stand up against arbitrary enforcement. Town hall meetings and community forums were filled to capacity as residents gathered to share their own experiences and to envision a future where creativity, history, and individuality were cherished rather than suppressed. Neighbors, once fearful of drawing the ire of an overzealous HOA enforcer, now spoke openly about their right to manage their property as a true reflection of their identity. Our homes and our history are our legacies, one impassioned resident declared at a bustling meeting, his voice echoing through the crowded room. The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal, a promise that Cedar Hollow Estates would forever honor the creative and historical spirit of its residents. Within the reformed HOA board and local government, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Susan Morales, launched comprehensive training programs on ethical governance, cultural sensitivity, and the preservation of historical landmarks. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary processes were established to ensure that every complaint would be handled with fairness and that no resident would ever again be subjected to arbitrary demolitions or punitive fines. Our duty is to protect not only our property rights, but also our heritage, Lieutenant Morales stated at a follow-up press conference, reinforcing our community's renewed commitment to justice and integrity. Community leaders and local historical societies joined forces to host workshops and public forums designed to educate residents about the importance of preserving our collective history and to encourage active participation in shaping a fair and inclusive governance model. When we stand together, our voices can rewrite the rules, a local activist proclaimed at one meeting, inspiring a groundswell of unity and determination among residents. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to fight back against the arbitrary demolition of my family's historical wall and to expose the injustice with every piece of digital evidence had not only reclaimed a treasured part of my heritage, but had also ignited a movement that resonated far beyond my own property. Neighbors who had long been silenced by fear and bureaucracy now found their voices, sharing their own stories of resistance and hope. The digital dossier that documented every moment of this battle became a symbol of our collective strength, a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of history and the right to live freely. Karen Miller, once the feared enforcer of the HOA's draconian rules, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a living reminder that no one is above accountability when a community unites for justice. Her influence diminished rapidly as digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, underscoring the need for reform and the perils of unchecked authority. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Hollow Estates, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the golden glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading, "Unity, Freedom, and Heritage," was unfurled between towering oaks, and heartfelt speeches echoed with promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate not only the victory over arbitrary rule, but also the preservation of our collective history and identity, Councilwoman Reed proclaimed, her voice ringing with determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our community's unyielding commitment to protect our heritage and our rights. As each new day dawned over Cedar Hollow Estates, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how the HOA demolished my 100-year-old wall and how the truth about my property ownership was revealed became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the importance of history, creativity, and personal freedom. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Cedar Hollow Estates, truth, justice, and individual expression would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our heritage and our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Hollow Estates would forever be a place where creativity, integrity, and respect for history shone as brightly as the first light of dawn.